2 spoons of borax can eliminate nearly any garden pest. The trick most gardeners miss. If you ask 10 gardeners what borax is for, most will mention laundry. If you ask what it does in the garden, many will immediately think of ants, and that is where a lot of people stop. But here is the contradiction. Many gardeners buy one product for ants, another for slugs, another for crawling insects, and then another product when the damage keeps showing up anyway. Yet in some situations, the same box of borax already sitting on a shelf can play a role in several of those problems. Not because borax is a miracle product, not because it works on every pest, but because many gardeners never learn where it helps, where it doesn't, and what condition changes the result. If you've ever walked outside and noticed ant trails running across a raised bed, seedlings disappearing overnight, leaves showing fresh chewing damage, or fruit beginning to suffer from repeated pest pressure, this video is for you. And the first use is probably the one most gardeners recognize immediately. Let's start with ants. If you've ever lifted a container and found a colony underneath, noticed ants moving through cracks in a patio garden, or watched them travel along the edges of raised beds, you've seen how quickly they can establish themselves. One common assumption is that ants are always the main problem. Often they are not. Sometimes the larger issue is what the ants are protecting. Aphids and other sap-feeding insects frequently produce sweet honeydew. Ants may protect those insects because they benefit from that food source. That means when gardeners focus only on spraying plants, the underlying activity can continue. This is one reason borax-based ant baits have remained popular for years. The goal is not simply to kill ants on contact. The practical advantage is that bait systems can help address activity back at the colony. That changes the outcome. Instead of seeing a few fewer ants today, gardeners may notice reduced traffic over time. The limitation is important. More borax is not automatically better. Poor placement, incorrect mixtures, or unrealistic expectations can reduce effectiveness. And if the ant activity is connected to a larger structural issue, additional measures may be necessary. The decision upgrade is simple. Instead of immediately reaching for a broad garden treatment, first determine whether ants are the visible problem or whether they are supporting another pest population. That small shift can save both time and money. But ants are relatively easy. What happens when the damage appears overnight and you never actually see the pest responsible? Many gardeners know this scene. You check healthy seedlings in the evening. The next morning, leaves are shredded. Tender lettuce has holes. Hostas look chewed. Young plants seem to disappear piece by piece. If you garden in a damp area, near mulch, around shaded beds, or beside consistently moist soil, slugs may be part of the problem. The common assumption is that every slug issue requires specialty products. Sometimes gardeners spend far more than necessary chasing a recurring problem. One reason borax attracts attention is that some gardeners use it as part of broader slug management efforts around specific problem zones. The practical reward here is not simply pest reduction, it is maintenance relief. When slug pressure drops around vulnerable seedlings, gardeners often spend less time replacing damaged plants. That can be especially important for container gardeners and small yard gardeners where every planting space matters. Notice the difference. The first benefit was largely about stopping visible ant activity. This benefit changes the amount of ongoing maintenance required. That is a different category of value. The limitation? Slugs thrive because of conditions. Moisture, hiding places, dense debris, and shade matter. No product changes those conditions by itself. If those factors remain untouched, the problem may return. A useful decision change is to inspect the environment first. Check boards, stones, wet mulch pockets, and dense ground cover before assuming you need another product. Aphids are another pest many gardeners overlook at first. One reason is that the damage often appears before the insects are noticed. When ant traffic suddenly increases around tender new growth, aphids are often worth checking for. This is also one of those situations where borax may play a role in the broader ant problem surrounding the infestation. The decision: whenever ant activity rises around soft new growth, inspect for aphids before treating the ant trail alone. Outdoor roaches create a different challenge. The insects you see are often only a small part of the activity. Moisture, debris piles, and protected hiding zones frequently support larger populations nearby. In situations like this, borax becomes less about chasing individual insects and more about targeting activity where it begins. A practical takeaway: inspect hiding zones before increasing treatment pressure. Earwigs can be surprisingly destructive on seedlings and tender growth. The challenge is that gardeners often discover the damage long before they discover the insects themselves. That makes identification especially important. Many gardeners spend money solving the wrong problem because the feeding damage is mistaken for disease or nutrient stress. Before assuming disease, nutrient deficiency, or another plant issue, look for signs of nighttime feeding activity. The useful lesson: confirm the source of the damage before choosing a treatment. And there is another overlooked detail. Some pests damage leaves. Others attack something far more expensive. What happens when the problem is not foliage at all, but the harvest you're waiting for? Now let's move beyond simple nuisance pests. Imagine a tomato plant that looked healthy a week ago. Fruit is developing, growth appears strong. Then you begin noticing damage that threatens the part you actually care about: the harvest. This is where many gardeners make an expensive mistake. They focus on visible plant growth and ignore the cost of losing fruit later. The reward category changes here. Instead of utility, we move into cost avoidance. Because protecting a harvest often saves more money, time, and effort than replacing damaged foliage. A practical way to think about borax is not only as a reaction tool. In some situations, gardeners use it as part of an overall prevention mindset. That distinction matters. Most gardeners think pest control begins when damage appears. Often the more valuable decision happens before major damage starts. If you've seen fruit scars, premature fruit loss, repeated pest pressure year after year, or harvest quality decline despite otherwise healthy plants, you know how frustrating that cycle can be. The evidence is simple observation. Gardeners repeatedly report that prevention is usually easier than recovery. The limitation is equally important. Not every pest problem has the same cause, and not every pest responds the same way. Treating every situation as identical often creates wasted effort. The decision upgrade becomes: do not wait until harvest damage becomes severe before evaluating pest pressure. That may sound obvious, but many gardeners only act after the loss becomes visible. And the next insight changes something even more important. Because many gardeners assume success depends mostly on the product. In reality, the application decision may matter more than the product itself. This is where the conversation becomes more interesting. Many gardeners assume a stronger product creates a better result. But the difference between success and failure is often timing. A treatment applied before a pest population explodes can perform very differently from one applied after serious damage appears. The product matters, but matching the application to the problem matters even more. That is the midpoint insight many people miss. Borax can be useful in some situations, not because it is stronger than everything else. It can be useful because the application matches the problem. Think about two gardeners facing similar pest pressure. One applies something everywhere. The other identifies where activity begins, where movement occurs, and where intervention matters most. The second gardener often makes fewer applications and spends less effort. That creates a completely different outcome. Container gardeners see this regularly. Raised bed gardeners see it too. The visible symptom may look identical. The underlying opportunity may not be. A common mistake is assuming more product creates better results. A better question is, what condition is allowing the pest problem to continue? That question changes behavior. Instead of treating everything, you begin targeting the source. The practical payoff is selection clarity. You stop wasting effort on actions that create little improvement. The limitation remains important. No single approach works for every pest, every garden, or every season. Weather, moisture, plant type, pest species, and garden layout all matter. The decision contrast looks like this. Before, apply broadly and hope for improvement. After, identify the pressure point first, then decide whether borax has a useful role. That alone can prevent a surprising amount of wasted effort. And the next section matters even more. Because some pests are annoying, others threaten the most valuable part of the garden. And the difference in potential loss can be dramatic. Because once you move into higher value crops, higher value beds, and higher value harvests, the cost of a pest problem changes dramatically. A few damaged leaves are frustrating. Losing a significant portion of a harvest is expensive. That is why experienced gardeners often pay more attention to difficult pest pressure than visible pest activity. The visible pest is not always the real threat. The real threat is the loss that follows. A few aphids may be annoying, but a pest population that grows unnoticed can become expensive very quickly. A damaged harvest often costs far more than a few damaged leaves, and that is why timing matters. Imagine spending months growing tomatoes, peppers, berries, or fruiting crops only to discover damage when harvest season finally arrives. At that point, recovery options become limited. The reward here is different from the earlier examples. Earlier, we talked about reducing nuisance pests. Now we are talking about protecting value, and that distinction matters. Many gardeners focus on what a pest is. Successful gardeners often focus on what that pest can cost. That shift changes decisions, it changes timing, and it changes where attention goes. When borax is discussed in higher value pest situations, the conversation becomes less about convenience and more about loss prevention. That is where the economic value begins to increase. The evidence is simple. A gardener can usually replace a damaged leaf. Replacing an entire season of lost production is another story. The limitation remains important. No product guarantees protection. No product eliminates every threat. Weather, disease pressure, growing conditions, and pest populations still matter. But preventing a major loss is usually worth far more than correcting a minor problem. The decision upgrade becomes prioritize threats based on potential damage, not visibility alone. That single adjustment often improves pest control decisions immediately. And that leads to one of the most overlooked lessons in the entire garden. Because some of the biggest losses happen before gardeners realize a problem is developing. Many gardeners wait for obvious signs. Visible chewing, visible insects, visible plant decline. But by the time damage becomes obvious, the opportunity for easy intervention may already be shrinking. This is where prevention becomes more valuable than reaction. Earlier, we looked at borax as a response. Now the reward evolves again. This becomes especially important with recurring fruit pests, harvest pests, and insects that appear in the same location season after season. Borax becomes part of a prevention mindset. That does not mean applying products everywhere. It means recognizing patterns before they become expensive. Repeated pest pressure in the same bed, the same crop suffering year after year, the same area attracting activity season after season. Those patterns matter. And gardeners who recognize those patterns often make better decisions long before serious damage occurs. The evidence is found in observation. The most productive gardens are rarely the ones that react fastest. They are often the ones that recognize problems earliest. The limitation? Observation requires consistency. You cannot identify patterns if you rarely inspect the garden. No product replaces attention. That remains true regardless of what you use. The decision upgrade is straightforward. Look for recurring pressure zones before looking for stronger products. That mindset often produces larger improvements than increasing treatment intensity. And now we arrive at the trick that many gardeners overlook. Not because it is complicated, but because most people never think about borax this way. The biggest value of borax is not necessarily that it can help with ants, or slugs, or crawling pests, or any single pest on today's list. The larger value is simplification. Most gardeners slowly accumulate solutions. One product for this issue, another product for that issue, another treatment for a different problem. Over time, the shelf gets crowded, costs increase, decisions become harder, and many gardeners end up managing products instead of managing problems. The hidden advantage is that borax can sometimes function as a first checkpoint rather than a last resort. That changes the decision process. Instead of immediately buying something new, you ask a different question. Does borax already have a useful role here? Notice what changed. The reward is no longer pest elimination. The reward is decision confidence. That is a much higher value outcome because it influences every future pest problem, not just one. The evidence is practical. Gardeners who develop simple decision systems typically spend less money, make faster choices, and avoid unnecessary purchases. The limitation is critical. Borax is not a universal solution. It is not appropriate for every pest. It is not appropriate for every situation, and treating it like a miracle product usually leads to disappointment. But treating it as a first evaluation step can create a completely different result. The final decision is simple. Before buying another pest control product, determine whether borax already offers a practical solution worth considering. That single habit can reduce spending, simplify decisions, and help protect future harvests. And once you start looking at borax through that lens, you begin to notice something surprising. Many of the most useful garden tools are not the most expensive. They are the ones most people overlook.